I'm very pleased to say that today we have Tim Crosland with us, who is an international human rights lawyer. He's worked for the government, he's worked against the government, and currently he's being prosecuted by the government. He was arrested at Parliament Square for allegedly supporting Palestine action. So today we're going to be talking about his values, his beliefs, his ideas, Defend the Juries, his campaign for Palestinian solidarity, and looking at what the future may potentially hold. So Tim, thank you very much for coming along today, and
good to be here.
We're going to have a conversation about you, your work, your life, and some of the opinions that you hold, and it'd be great to understand a little bit more about what you stand for. So my first question really is, could you tell us a little bit about your upbringing, where you grew up, and anything that helped, to shape your current points of view about life?
I grew up in a place called Barnes in southwest London. Very sort of middle class kind of place, very privileged place in all sorts of ways. And my father made quite a lot of money. There's a lot of material prosperity around us. I think in those early years, I felt I've felt slightly uncomfortable with my surroundings. Didn't completely believe in them. Growing up in that part of London, didn't completely believe in the culture around me. I became very attached to the natural world. At a young age, I was like, if we'd go to a lake or something, I would see on the surface of the lake an animal that was drowning, a bee or something. I would feel an obligation to rescue that bee, to get it onto my hand, to swim back to the shore. And I don't quite know where that came from. It felt very natural to me. I felt this alliance with the natural world. And I was troubled by a sense that, I could see it around me, that not being shared. And I wouldn't have had the words at that age to describe a kind of consumerism, but I felt that, and I felt that wasn't right. I then had an education, a very privileged mainstream education, where I look back on it, and institutions like a private school, like Oxford University, where people would go, well, how lucky you were to have that education.
Yeah.
But I look back on it now and think, at no point during those years was I exposed to properly critical political thought. At no point during that time was there any questioning of the basic assumptions of, let's call it, Western society, and the exploitation that depends on, whether of people, whether of natural resources.
Yeah.
So in some ways, although there's lots to be grateful for in my upbringing, and I had things that so many people do not have, I also look back on it as a time of a kind of miseducation.
Right. And during those, let's say, youthful years, through your studies, did you start to form some more kind of politicized views at that point, or was it after you finished studying?
Really comes later. I mean, I feel the seeds of it. I can look back on and just little incidents. I remember my father talking about a friend of his who was going to come for lunch, a prosecuting barrister. And maybe I was 7 years old. And I remember reacting to that word, a prosecutor. Yeah. Why would you want to meet a prosecutor, Dad? That's a horrible job, prosecuting people. And I refused to be there at that lunch. Really? But I don't know, where that came from, but I felt it so strongly.
Right.
And then I guess it's a little bit later on that I had some more direct experiences of injustice as a young barrister. First big case I'm involved in as a trainee barrister happens to be a case concerning a Muslim family. Very, very tragic situation. A young woman has died, and she's died through a sort of process of exorcism.
Right.
and his whole family has been involved, and I'm acting with more senior lawyers for a young man who was 18 at the time. He was asked to participate in this exorcism and given a stick and told that to expel the I think it was the jinns, he needed to strike his sister with this stick. And even on the prosecution case, all he had done was touch her.
Right.
Just touched her. And at the time I felt a strong connection to him because I had a younger sister who struggled with mental health issues, and that was a painful thing. And I could see the time, this was a long trial at the Old Bailey, the time I spent with Hafiz, it was really clear to me he was a caring person who cared about his sister.
Yeah.
And he just wanted to do what he thought was going to help her, and caught between, different ways of looking at the world. It was very shocking to me when he was convicted of manslaughter, when he was jailed for 18 months.
Right.
Because even on the Crown's case, the prosecution case, what he had done was a very gentle thing and a caring thing, and he was caught in a tragic situation.
But his sister died.
But his sister died through what other people had done.
Sure.
And I felt there was something wrong with the legal system that allowed this to happen, that didn't even want to talk really about the position that Hafiz had been in and what his motivations were. I remember talking to the lead lawyer and saying, why aren't you putting it to the jury that Hafiz was trying to help his sister, that is an act of self-defense? I remember that. And he said, politically, I can't go there. I can't do that. So that was a significant part of my sort of early legal career.
I understand. Okay, so thank you so much for that. So we're going to talk about Defend Our Juries in a moment. But before that type of work, I know you were very much involved in, you could say, environmental activism. You've spoken a little bit about how, since your childhood, you'd always felt a closeness to nature, to the environment. But can you explain a little bit more about how you went to that type of activism? Since you spoke about this particular case in this situation.
So shortly after I left government, this was February 2015, I started researching the climate crisis and reading up about it, reading the science, and it felt like a kind of horror movie. I remember thinking, if people actually know how bad this is, they know the scale of the threat to life, how come nothing is happening? And sort of relatively quickly found out that come December, there were going to be talks in Paris, the UN talks, and I ended up getting invited to those talks through the work that I was doing to act for some of the small island states who didn't have big armies of lawyers to help with the negotiations. And that is the process that ended up in the Paris Agreement on climate change. It was the first time there was recognition of this. I mean, some people will have heard of this now, the 1.5 degree temperature limit. And through talking to those delegations, I understood the significance of that. It sounds like a number. The advice, the research that they had showed that was their lifeline, their survival. Because beyond that limit, as the climate system works its way through, there are small island states who will just disappear beneath the waves.
So were you representing those islands in some way, or were you
representing those countries at the climate talks at COP21?
Right.
And we end up with this agreement that gives recognition to the significance of that limit, but there's no enforcement mechanism. So it allows all those politicians to slap each other on the back and big applause, and this is a historic moment, and in some ways it was, but there was nothing to hold anybody to account for it.
Absolutely,
And given the countervailing pressures from industry and dependence on oil, if there's no accountability, it's not going to happen. So the next step, from my point of view, was setting up this charity Plan B.Earth, The purpose of that was to hold the British government to account through the courts for what it had committed to. And how come you're enacting all these policies that are so obviously inconsistent with the 1.5 degrees you're telling everybody about? How does that work? And we brought a number of cases to focus on that discrepancy between action and words. And I started to get a sense that the power of those cases was less what was happening through the courts, because the judges, in many ways, part of the establishment. And to be fair, it's a difficult thing as a judge to make a call on something that impacts the whole of the economy, as fossil fuels do. And more powerful was the kind of movement that built up around those legal proceedings. The young people outside the courtroom. And so that was a significant moment for me. So
you went from working for the government to
suing the government,
right,
to now being prosecuted by the government. Yeah, every angle on the courtroom, you could say.
Goodness me. Okay, so what role do you see law, and in particularly the jury system, playing in holding governments to account? So in this case, did you manage to achieve anything? Was there actually any impact?
From these cases, I think there was impact. There was impact mainly outside the courtroom. The lead lawyer for the government in the first case that we bring, a guy called Tim Lord, who was acting for the government. Later he leaves government and he puts online a story of the net zero target. And he talks about this legal case that we bring as being a key factor in that. He goes, go back to 2017, net zero was not in any of the main parties' manifestos. Then Plan B, bring a legal challenge. Suddenly people start to talk about it. Coincidence, question mark. The next case we bring around the expansion of Heathrow Airport. This is an interesting thing that happens. The lead lawyer against us in that case, a guy called Niall Toru, working for the Department of Transport. At the end of the case, he goes off and starts working for Friends of the Earth.
Right.
And there are other factors involved, no doubt. But I think it is interesting to see the legal process here as a form of dialogue. It's a moment when people have to read,
have to engage
the evidence. They have to look at those submissions. And it's quite difficult to see evidence after evidence about the threat to life, the threat to your own children, the threat to your own families, your own communities, and be indifferent to that. So that is what we were putting. And I do believe it had an impact.
So really what you're saying is if people are sincere to the truth, then they should, change really their views and ideas, because the evidence is there.
The evidence is there in overwhelming form. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so my next question is about Defend Our Juries. And really I'd like to understand a little bit more about what this campaign or project organization is and why is it important for you?
Okay. Well, I'll just say a little bit about that name, Defend Our Juries, because easy to imagine it's all about jury trial. And in some ways that's the starting point, but it isn't just about jury trial. We're taking juries, which is 12 randomly selected members of the public, chosen by sortition, you could call it, random process. There's a little oasis of democracy, where ordinary people come together and make important political decisions, and in theory, not influenced by power, not influenced by big corporations. And that process is potentially an antidote to corruption. Go back to the origins of jury trial and sortition, go back to ancient Greece, where politicians were chosen by sortition, they were randomly chosen. That was the thought process. That's the way you counter corruption. And the other thing that we've seen in this, process of jury trial, where in recent years you have judges trying to compromise the jury, take away their power, remove legal defences from the jury, we see in that a kind of almost a symbol of colonialism, of imperialism, where you preserve the illusion of democratic process or of jury trial, but actually power tries to take power away from ordinary people. So that's the deeper sense of Defend Our Juries, you know, wanting to give power to ordinary people.
Can you just maybe explain that from the point of view of where do you feel that there has been some corruption of the juries, or there has been some removal of that power or say of the juries themselves then?
Yeah, well, this is a really good question. Just the last few years, there's been a lot of protest in this country, whether around racial justice, climate justice, and at least a couple of years back, those cases started to come before juries, and maybe the juries are hearing for the first time the evidence about government betrayal on climate breakdown. How long governments have had that evidence and sat on it and done nothing.
Right.
Or maybe they're hearing for the first time directly the experience of people being deported for no good reason. They're hearing about the genocide in Gaza on the trial of Palestine Action. And they're getting all that evidence, and the juries are quitting.
Right.
And you can imagine that that is an alarming thing for those in power, for the corporations that hear the cases put to the jury, and maybe our windows have been broken at JP Morgan, or maybe, you know, our arms in the factories have been destroyed, and the jury is siding with the people who took the sledgehammers to the arms. Wow, you know, where does this end up? And then what we see, and we've got this all documented, series of meetings between the CEO of Elbit Systems and the Home Secretary. We're very concerned. Right. We're very concerned about this pattern of jury acquittals. You know, we could take our business elsewhere. Right. So a lot of people we employ here in Britain, and most of those minutes are now redacted. You know, just lots of black marker, but there'll be little bits still left over. Because otherwise it would be embarrassing. And you can see a note to the Minister from the Permanent Secretary, the purpose of the meeting, to reassure Elbit Systems we take their concerns seriously. Right. With the climate activists, we saw one defence after another being removed. So the defence of justification, trying to prevent a greater harm, trying to prevent mass loss of life. No, the jury not allowed to consider that. Right. The defence of proportionality, which is normally available. No, the jury not allowed to consider that. Right.
So what you're saying is that while the juries are still there, they're being told that you can't take into consideration A, B, C. You have to make a decision on this issue alone.
Did the person sit in the road? If the answer is completely your decision, members of the jury, if the answer is yes, guilty verdict.
Without taking into consideration the context.
Without any context, without the other side of the story, without hearing why people did what they did. And this comes to an extreme point in 2023 when we have 3 people jailed just for using the words climate change in court. When a judge has directed, you must not use those words in court because they are irrelevant.
So who were the people jailed, as in amongst the defendants?
Defendants who are being tried for their protests, which is sitting in the road. And as they explained to the jury why they were sitting in the road,
they said, no, you can't say that.
You cannot say that.
Goodness.
And then 3 people defied the judge because they said, I am on oath. I've taken an oath to tell the jury the whole truth. If the jury don't hear why I was in the road, how is this a fair trial? How can they understand? Where are they getting the other side of the story that is meant to define the legal system?
And who's giving these guidelines to the judge, or to say that this is how much only can be the remit of this discussion or this case or this prosecution? Where is that coming from then?
Well, some of those decisions are coming from the higher courts, so the Court of Appeal removing those defences and saying they do not apply in the context of protest actions, and then judges interpreting those decisions to say, well, if you haven't got a defence, then the reason why you did something isn't relevant, and I'm not going to allow you to put irrelevant information to the jury. So it's step by step. And you then have somebody, a retired social worker called Trudy Warner, who's watching these trials and thinking, well, this is not a real trial. These are show trials.
Yeah.
These are fake trials. And she remembers something she has been taught at school. 69 years old at the time, but she remembers this from being 16, that a jury has an absolute right to acquit a defendant as a matter of conscience,
Right.
whatever the judge says.
Okay.
So she holds this message on a sign outside the court.
Okay.
It's a principle of law. It's actually there in marble outside the Old Bailey,
Yeah.
inside the Old Bailey.
Yeah.
She is arrested.
Goodness.
She is arrested for trying to influence the jury. She's then sent to the Old Bailey for contempt of court, facing a prison sentence. And that is when Defend Our Juries emerges. And a group come together and go, you know, this is wild, this repression. This has got nothing to do with the democratic freedoms we were told that we have in this country. What are we going to do about it? And that's where we come up, I mean, a group of us with this idea of solidarity actions. We will all do the same thing as Trudy Warner. And if enough of us do it, the state is going to have no answer, because they will just be arresting and prosecuting hundreds of us for holding the same sign. That way they won't be able to brush it under the carpet. Everybody's going to hear about it. Everybody's going to see it. And the craziness of this situation will be exposed.
Yeah.
So that is the seeds of Defend Our Juries.
So this example you've given of holding signs with a message on it, I can see that there's strong similarity to the activism around those who disagree with the proscription of Palestine action. So can you explain a little bit about how you went from your work with Defend Our Juries to now your campaign and activism in solidarity with the Palestinian cause? How did that come about?
So part of the intention for focusing on the court system was this felt like a common site of repression. So a site of intersection for a lot of causes. Because anyone who's in resistance to injustice, anyone who's really exposing power or the abuse of power, they find themselves in the crosshairs of the legal system. So this is what we imagined would happen. This was a way to link causes so that causes are not all in their silos, you know, all separated from each other, but actually seeing their common connections. And so although this begins with climate activists, we're also seeing what's happening to Palestine action. And we're seeing the same lobbyists from the oil and arms industry who are campaigning for tougher measures and lobbying and influencing and spreading their influence across Whitehall. It's their same clients. And there are a couple of names I'm going to mention, like Lord Walney, lobbyist for both the oil and arms industry.
Right.
In May of last year, he puts out a report. It's presented as an independent report. He's presented as an independent advisor, calls for both Just Stop Oil and Palestine action to be banned.
Right.
And it just so happens that would rather suit the people who are paying him, the oil industry and the arms industry. And in the months after he puts out that report, we see dozens and dozens of principled people jailed. Just Stop Oil activists jailed for 4 and 5 years.
Yeah.
And then a group of Palestine action activists who are jailed on remand before they've been convicted of anything.
Yeah.
And Defend Our Juries then sort of launches the Free Political Prisoners campaign, which is both about the climate activists who've been convicted and jailed, and also the Palestine action activists who are in jail for taking a stand against genocide.
You know,
And this is before they're prescribed.
Before they're prescribed. Now that Palestine action has been prescribed, some would say that showing support to such an organization is actually, maybe counterproductive, or counterproductive from the point of view that you are you yourself have put yourself in that position of being arrested, being potentially charged, being sent to jail, and that own person's responsibility, that they have to accept that nobody else, the government hasn't told them to go and do that. So if in the end they do end up in jail, then it is as a result of their own conscious action. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I would agree with that, absolutely. I think it's incredibly important that anyone who does take action with that potentiality knows what they're doing and understands the risks that they're taking and is willing to take those risks, as principled people have done through history. And maybe the worst thing that can happen is that somebody steps into a form of direct action, a form of civil disobedience without being aware of those risks. So, I would absolutely agree that in one sense, someone who takes that kind of action must assume personal responsibility. But I would also say this: those people who do not challenge the abuse of power, who do not challenge authoritarianism, who do not challenge fascism, they must take responsibility too. Because if we see the trends emerging in society and a rising fear and a rising loss of freedom, then the people who took no action against that when all the signs were there, they are going to have to look at themselves in the mirror as well. So, in one sense, I think all we're saying is everybody must take responsibility for their actions here, one way or another.
You yourself were arrested at Parliament Square. Is that correct?
I was arrested at Parliament Square on the 5th of July. This was the first Palestine action. This was the day the prescription came into force, and it was the first lift the ban action. So it was a group of just over 20 of us, yes.
Okay. And do you feel at this stage that from the point of yourself being arrested to the point of now, I don't know, maybe nearly 1,000 people being arrested for holding up a sign, do you feel this has been justified to do that at this point?
I think it's over 2,000 people
over 2,000
now. Yes,
people.
It is. And if you just think about what happens when the terrorism laws get extended, and the terrorism laws are no longer applied to people advocating for violence. They're applied to people who are advocating to end violence. They're applied to people who are taking action which causes economic loss to the rich and the powerful. Well, what can that mean? Who's next? The trade unions? Everybody who takes a stand against the abuse of power? And that happened so quickly. It was a period of 2 weeks before Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, says this is what we plan to do between it coming into force. There is no time for anybody to think about the implications. When Parliament votes on that order, they're given a choice of, if you want to vote against this order, you must vote in favour of the murder maniacs cult and the Russian Imperial Reserve.
Because they were all put
together.
They
were all bundled together.
Yeah.
And so you have this hugely significant constitutional shift taking place without any time for anyone to really understand what is happening. And so as a Democrat, as somebody who believes in dialogue, who believes, nothing is more important that we understand the threats that we face and the challenges that we must confront together. Well, this period since the 5th of July, if you think about how much has been written, how much has been said, how many alliances have been forged, how this has brought, climate activists into communion with organisations like CAGE, how we've understood for the first time, the draconian nature of those terrorism powers, what they can do to communities, what they can do to families. Wow, yes, I would not take those months away for anything.
Okay, so, these last months and even years, we've seen a lot of activism on the streets of London, at universities. Today we've heard that there is a ceasefire in Gaza, but a lot of people are questioning how long it may or may not last. But what gives you hope or keeps you positive when it comes to your activism and potentially the activism of hundreds and thousands, maybe millions of others? What do you think is the thing that should keep us carry on doing what we are doing?
It's a strange thing to say, a strange way to answer you, but in some ways what gives me hope is the extreme state repression. The way all these people have been arrested, and the reason that gives me hope is because it just shows how fearful that the state is of people coming together. It shows how fearful it is of the trade unions coming together with Muslim communities, with climate activists, with Black Lives Matter, the sort of things that have been happening around these protests. And that is why this repression has begun, because that is the one thing that the oil and arms industries do not have a good answer to. It is mass mobilizations. We've seen that over and over again through history. It's the coming up for marking the day the Berlin Wall comes down in November 1989. This is a few days after 500,000 people gather in protest in East Germany, and the wall comes down. It's the climate protests in 2019 that forced the government to acknowledge the reality of this emergency, to bring in a net zero target. That's what gets the oil industry starting to reframe the debate. It's the one thing that those dirty billions cannot buy, is people coming together. And I think we are seeing that. And we're seeing the power of the demonstrations in Italy, in this country, internationally, because that cannot be ignored. And ultimately politicians know that mass sentiment on the street cannot be ignored. So that is what gives me hope.
There are people who I would say have lost confidence in the system itself. There are people who hoped that with a Labour government, that there would actually be more justice, more kind of looking out for the oppressed or the poor, and we seem to have seen the opposite. Some people would say that that the system is something that really needs to be looked at. How would you respond to that?
I would say those people have got a point.
Yeah.
I would. And it's not just that it's a Labour government and Labour having its origins in collective action in ordinary people. It's look at the individuals. The Prime Minister, a human rights lawyer. That's how he made his name. Shabana Mahmood, who in 2014 was taking part in a die-in in Birmingham, in Sainsbury's, against their stocking of goods from the occupied territories. Richard Hermer, KC, the Attorney General, who not long ago in private practice was acting for Shamina Begum, was given his career to fighting injustice. And what happens when those people get into power? And maybe the truth is they're not really in power. Maybe the truth is it's other people in power, faceless people, it's corporations. And it's not that hard to see why they might have power, because we are at a point of economic crisis in this country, internationally. And if you have big corporations saying, look, unless you do what we want here, we're going to pull out and we're going to move somewhere else and take with it all those jobs. And your responsibility as the leader of that country is to keep people in employment, because you're thinking if we have an economic crisis, the tensions are going to be even worse. You can see how this happens. And I think we have a responsibility to try and get ourselves into the shoes of those people. Because you imagine, a major economic depression and all the tensions we are already seeing on the streets and how that would feed it. There isn't an easy answer, but we need to be honest about it. And that to me is what is missing in so much of the dialogue, because it is so overwhelming. You see groups getting into their silos, demonizing the other, whoever it is, whether it is the Muslims, whether it is the Jews, whether it is the politicians, whether it is the corporations, and there is not enough trying to get to the root of what is going so wrong in our societies. There's not enough honesty about it. And there's not enough honesty that the basic economic model we have is not sustainable. And nobody should suggest there are simple answers to that, but unless we are honest about it, and if we keep distracting ourselves from it by blaming other groups or other individuals, then we don't have a chance. And I do keep coming back to a quote from the activist James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And that is, I think, a fair call for us to put to our politicians, that instead of telling us fairy tales about how they're going to make everything better, they are honest. They are honest about the severity of the intersecting crises we face.
Thank you very much, Tim. It's been really interesting to listen to you and to be educated about how the justice system, it itself needs to be maintained. It itself needs to be closely, looked at in order to ensure that justice is actually being upheld.
Thank you very much, Naz. Yeah, really good talking to you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.